Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here. Um, for This is for your 40th anniversary of the publication of The Mind of China, which came out in 1972, and a 34th year anniversary of Philosophy East, Philosophy West, which came out in 1978. So I'm very privileged to be here and interview you today.
And I would add this book, which is much newer, and in some ways, since it's written by one person alone, more interesting.
Fantastic. So a comparative history of world philosophy.
That's right. From the Upanishads to Kant. There's not much to elaborate, but actually my interests, which fit the kind of work I do, are in all the social sciences, maybe especially psychology, and certainly in literature. And therefore, and there was even a moment when I didn't have a job in philosophy when I got enrolled in an NYU program for clinical psychology. But then I got a job, so it didn't seem worthwhile continuing that way. But in terms of my basic interests, my interest is equal in them, though obviously I spent more time in philosophy because I had to develop a career in it. I do remember him. This was in Brooklyn College, which is now Brooklyn University. And I even remember his name, which is unusual, because I have a very bad memory for names. It was Kretschmann. And he liked the way I wrote. And he suggested I go to Harvard, and he wrote a letter there recommending me. And since I meant anyway to have an academic career, I did that. But that was a simple accident. Even my interest in China first developed there because I think he gave me a book by Lawrence Binion called The Mind of China. It's a small, very well-written romantic book, and I liked it very much.
So while studying in Harvard, you mentioned that the teacher who impressed you the most was Harry Wolfson. In terms of philosophers, who did you find most inspirational during this period?
Well, it didn't interest me. I'm not sure he interested me as a philosopher. He interested me as a person who taught philosophy and had a specialty in it. And he was quite remarkable. I think he was atheistic, or at least he wasn't interested in pursuing the Talmud anymore. And he had a very good English style, but a very strong non-English accent. So he had a weird feeling of a person who speaking a language very well, who couldn't pronounce it accurately. And he had, for years, he had very few philosophy students, but then something happened, I've forgotten just what, and he got a lot of students. Many of them were Christians or even Jesuits, and he loved the idea that here was the little Jew from a town, say, in Russia, teaching graduate students in philosophy or in analogous subjects at Harvard. Now, if you want to ask what was remarkable about him, apart from that we spoke, he had an equal knowledge and interest in Greek philosophy, Latin philosophy, Western philosophy, philosophy written by Arabs or Muslims, and it was simply extremely broad. And he had a list of questions, all difficult. He had even an ambition. His ambition was to cause the rewriting of the whole history of philosophy, which now modern philosophy begins with Descartes conventionally and ends wherever you happen to be. And he wanted to change it. He wanted to make Spinoza the critical turning point, because before Spinoza in the Middle Ages, philosophy was very strongly influenced by theology. It became in that sense a mixed subject, slightly superstitious even from his standpoint. And Spinoza returned philosophy to pure philosophy. He had that influence. So his ambition was, through his writings, to change the general conception of the history of philosophy. And that he was not successful. But he asked pointed, difficult questions, all of which he answered from his knowledge of 3 or 4 different traditions, which is very unusual, and he did it very exactly and interestingly. Well, it's a turning point in a very simple way. If you want a career in philosophy, the key is the doctorate. And I was very practical about it. I decided to write something that would interest me and interest others, but that I could finish quickly with the resources of the library at Columbia alone. The subject I chose was the originality of Bergson, who then was a famous philosopher. And the subject of originality interests me just as it does in art. And the answer was sort of mixed. He was original in some things, but in many things perhaps less original. And since I arranged it so practically, I finished the doctorate with about a year and a half of work, half time. And I got my doctorate at the age of 23, which if I had exploited it would have helped me get along much faster.
And would you say that this was the period when you began seeing yourself as a comparative philosopher?
Apparently, because that's something I remember the discussion I had with Wolfson, which he tried over a very long period of time to convince me to follow him in his specialty, be a kind of successor. And one of the arguments he used, that others used at the time too, that it was very hard for a Jew to get a job in philosophy, except maybe as a certain kind of specialist. He happened to be wrong, but it was a very general opinion held by another teacher, Jewish teacher at Harvard too, who taught logic. But I remember the reasons. He said the following, is really his position. What is really difficult in the study of philosophy or the history of philosophy is the problem of method. The method which is ideal for producing good philosophy in that sense is a Talmudic method. No one should go into the subject without studying Talmudic method first. Whereas languages, he said, are easy. You can pick them up on your own. It so happened that I had the contrary idea. I thought his idea of method was very easy to understand. I had studied some Talmud, but it didn't harm, but it wasn't necessary. Whereas I found languages were difficult for me to study. I was beyond the age when languages are easy, and I started Latin and Greek, and then I thought if I wanted to go into comparative philosophy, I'd have to go 3 or 4 more languages, and all that was too difficult. So I conceived a different program for myself, in which I would study not languages per se, because that study takes up a great deal of time, and when you're finished studying it, you don't know the language as well as people who've studied it from birth or as scholars. And the books you have to read are all translated, many translations, and some of them must be good. And therefore, if you want to study in a comparative way, you can forget the languages, imagine that the translations, or some of them, are really good. Imagine that the secondary literature, some of it is really good. And then you can learn, you can consider the subject from the standpoint of psychology and sociology and art, and yet a much broader conception than you would get if you were strictly a student of philosophy via its language. That's my self-justification.
Very good. I would say probably the only risk you'd be taking with that is to rely heavily on translations, though.
Yes.
Yes.
You must do that. You must learn to be critical about it. You must be careful about it. But I had a friend who is a scholar in Indian philosophy, and he said none of the translations are any good. I said, in that case, why do you or other people translate? Oh, it's a game they play with one another. But that means that all the scholarship is total loss, and that didn't seem to be reasonable at all.
Okay. What are, in your opinion, the criterions that define a comparative philosopher?
Well, the question answers itself. You start with a notion that comparison makes things more clear. And the simplest examples are examples of color vision. When you put one color near a complementary color or a highly contrasting color, it becomes much easier to see. It's like a statue which you can either see from one point of view, or you can go around the statue and see it from all points of view. So it seemed to be very clear to me that people could understand even themselves and their own thought if they knew a thought which was distinctly different, and could furnish a possibility of comparison, as in colors.
So what are the biggest challenges or obstacles that you face as a comparative philosopher?
The challenges are to ask questions, the answers to which are possible, and the answers to which are productive because they illuminate what you are discussing in the way that comparative philosophy is supposed to illuminate. And the deeper the questions, the more interesting, and the better your ability to answer them, then the social result is more useful. The way I teach my students now, the subject is basically comparative art, is to ask them to read my book and then come in and then write out for them questions in which I don't take what the book says for granted as even as true. They're provocative and difficult questions, even too difficult ones, to sort of alert them into thinking. And the only, not a difficulty, I take it on myself to, after they're finished, to answer the questions. But of course I can answer them, of course, by saying I don't know, in a complicated way. Well, that seems to be true. But that I was the founder was a kind of accident, because I was the only one there. And the university then was growing very rapidly. It was quite possible to get other teachers and accept more students. And that was exactly how I became the head. But as the head, I had principles that were different from those in most departments. It's, I think, still true that comparative philosophy is not taught in American universities except in Hawaii. There may be other exceptions. The basic reason being that non-Americans, say, philosophers, find it very difficult to believe that they can learn anything of any importance from the philosophy of another culture. It just seems to me unreasonable. They happen to be wrong, but it doesn't change their attitude. Look, every one of them goes through many steps before he gets a doctorate and becomes a teacher. And then if he wants to learn Chinese or Indian philosophy, he becomes a beginner again. Why should he do that if the departments don't require it of him? In fact, if he does teach it, they look on him maybe a bit suspiciously. So the department in Tel Aviv was designed from the beginning to be different. The idea was that these philosophies should be an inherent part of philosophy, that you shouldn't ever learn only Western philosophy or only Chinese philosophy or only Indian philosophy. You have to learn at least one other to some degree. And also to take philosophy in a very wide sense instead of a narrow sense. There was a man who succeeded me at one time as department head, and all he wanted to do was to teach professionals, would-be professionals. My idea was exactly the opposite, that philosophy is useful not primarily as a profession, but it helps people in general to think more clearly. Therefore, I wanted as many people to study as possible.
Did you have any other goals for the department itself?
Oh, to be a good department to grow, and there was one that was difficult, and it eventually succeeded. That is, departments, like any other human group, are riven by disagreements and differences in temperament. There was even a teacher who was close to paranoid. He was very meticulous about his ideas, very insistent on them. We were quite different personalities. So I waited for a time when the department would not include such contradictory initial people, that they were more or less at peace with one another. And that time arrived. I don't know how long it was. It remained or will remain, because it's just a happy accident. For a time, certainly, yes. I was very happy over it, too. When I asked myself, my wife wanted to stay here. I wanted, after a while, to return to the United States. We had even a job offered there. When I asked myself what I could do that I couldn't do in the States, the answer was to found a department that was essentially molded by myself. What happened in my life was something rather different. In 1950-51, I was invited to teach at the Riali School in Haifa. It's a famous school, and they also had a Teachers Institute there. I came and I taught. Teaching was interesting, but part of it was difficult, because the Riali School was run a little bit like a military academy, and very, very strict about discipline. And that was exactly the opposite. I was very free and didn't discipline. I remember to this day we're in a room on the first floor the day when some student opened the window and 2 or 3 students jumped out. But I also carried out interesting experiments. I wanted to teach, for example, that history is a very complex and difficult and problematic subject. So we got some students to run into the class and do something unusual, and let's say let an animal go free and so on. Then those students left, and half of the class went with those students and sat outside of the classroom. Then I asked each of the people who had experienced what they saw, what exactly they saw, and that was written down. There were lots of discrepancies. And then we called in the students outside one by one and asked them what they had seen. And then the student went outside again, and the next student was in. There were so many differences that it was quite clear that direct observation is not nearly enough, and the lesson was how difficult history to write, especially not only the history of that one session, but the history of Tel Aviv, the history of Israel, the history of the world. So it's full of all sorts of misleading statements. You know that to begin with, but you have no substitute.
A point in your career where you found hindrance in publishing your own work of comparative philosophy?
I'm not sure, because what happens, you have two sources of publication. One is the normal commercial press, and the other is academic publishers. And there's some publishers that are in between, Oxford University presses, all of those things. In the beginning I had no trouble, but there were books that I sent around to dozens of academic publishers, and none of them wanted to publish it. So luckily enough, you hit someone who is willing or interested in it. They also are much influenced by sales, by profits, because they're afraid that there'll be no profit, they won't publish it. And if you ask about the future of comparative philosophy, my answer is that on the one hand, you could say that it has no future for the same reason that it was never successful. People are not convinced it makes any sense. But history, but certain changes have taken place in the world. Not too many years ago, when you can ask about it, when China was beginning to redevelop, the study of Chinese philosophy seemed for a while unimportant. I think that Yoav, when he was in China the first time, was asked to teach Confucius in a Chinese university.
Wow.
Very difficult to conceive, but it's true. But nationalism usually overcomes any such restrictions, and the Chinese, of course, are quite nationalistic, and now they study their own philosophy very closely and carefully. And China has become so important that people will want to study Chinese thought because they want to go to China, because the Chinese is becoming as bad as important in the world as the United States. And it seems an opening. The language, too, seems an opening to a great deal. India is also developing, though not to the same degree. And there was a time when Indian philosophy was very little studied in India. They have classical schools, but now it's clear that it is studied, and it may influence the world to a lesser degree than China to become interested in Indian thought too. So on the one hand, my answer is negative. On the other hand, there's this opening, the importance of which I can't estimate. Yes.
Can you please define your concerns further on this issue?
Curiosity is a trait that you find in many animals. There's no creature more curious than, say, our cat, or cats in general. And there's nothing in this house that she hasn't touched with her whiskers, which are a very sensitive organ. And if anything is moved a little bit, she will come and look and touch it with her whiskers again to make sure where it is. Now, the reason why curiosity is so important is that it's related to your ability to live in any environment whatsoever. You know what you have to do, you know what you have to avoid. And the cat is very neatly balanced between curiosity and fear. It runs at the slightest hint of something frightening, which is a way of course, of saving your life. Among the curious creatures, the most successfully curious are human beings. And I think that curiosity is therefore a trait, the study of which in humans will explain a great deal about their culture. I even define art in terms of reaction to curiosity. And with imagination and curiosity work together, that is, your curiosity requires an imagination, the imagination requires curiosity, and they work together and they teach you about the world. And its curiosity, of course, led me to read Chinese. I read everything, but I read Chinese and Indian philosophy and whatever else I did read.
So, in your opinion, going back to comparative philosophy, in your opinion, in what way is the shift to comparativism possible for the departments?
It was already made, and that is, made means that you can study Indian and Chinese philosophy either as a beginner or in more advanced studies, and the initial teachers already have successors. And of course, I think I was in a way indirectly responsible for the existence of the Department of East Asian Studies. I started to propagandize for the study of Asian studies about 10 years before anything at all happened. And I don't think it happened in the end because of me, but certainly I was working toward that end. And it's good that there's now no deep divide between Asian studies and philosophy. I think that's very useful. And the department itself will certainly develop because Asia becomes progressively more important in human life. Well, there are an indefinite number of subjects in early Chinese philosophy. Mohism is one of the more interesting. Even its basic idea of, if I'm not mistaken, that you are looking for agreement and whatever is good in human life, combined with beginning of research that never developed very far in technical logic. So that's one of the more interesting subjects in the early development of Chinese philosophy, but that it developed much further later on in Zhuangzi. I think you find a mention of 100 schools of philosophy.
That's right.
A large variety, some of which were retained and some of which vanished. But Zhuangzi is one of the most interesting ones in general. Do you know him? Have you read him at all?
I've read a little bit, yes.
Not only is it full of stories, but it has some extremely intelligent remarks about the nature of thought in general. What interests me in particular in Zhuangzi is not only the question of who proves the truth, who is the judge of the truth you have discovered, and who is the judge of the judge, and who is the final judge when there isn't any. But another one, the different polar differences. We tended to divide everything to think easily into right and wrong, left and right, dangerous and undangerous. This is all of extreme interest, importance in the way we learn to live. On the other hand, when you make those distinctions, you make everything black and white, and you forget that that most of the area is essentially gray and neither black nor white. And by sticking to polarized thinking, you make the history of thought much less interesting and much less credible. You have to include the grays, and you have to take steps to do it, although you can't avoid the yes and no at all. Well, Marxism is a theory of eventual mutual love. separated by a period of extreme struggle and cruelty from its goal, which is anarchism. So that's the difference.